I just wanted to say something briefly about whistleblowers, because my job as a journalist depends on whistleblowers a lot, along with other journalists. Nearly 30 years ago now, The Guardian had a very traumatic experience with a whistleblower. Possibly, no, not all of you are too young to remember that, but some of you will remember that very clearly. It's in 1983, 28 years ago, The Guardian was forced by a court to hand over documents about the arrival of cruise missiles, which had been sent to them anonymously. And The Guardian fought the case as hard as it could and rather naively believed that the courts would protect them because they were defending a journalistic source, even though they didn't know who it was. We were wrong. The judges refused to protect us, and they ordered The Guardian to hand over the documents. And The Guardian's then editor, faced with the prospect of sequestration of the company's entire assets if he refused, handed them over and crossed his fingers that no harm would come of it. Unfortunately, he was wrong, because it turned out that there were particular staple marks or punch hole marks on the documents which enabled Foreign Office investigators to identify the source of the documents as a young Foreign Office clerk called Sarah Tisdall. As a result of this, Sarah Tisdall was arrested and jailed under the Official Secrets Act. Yeah. And it was worse for her than for the paper, because she went to jail and served 4 months. But it was a horribly traumatic experience for everybody at The Guardian. I wasn't there at the time, so I can't speak to exactly what occurred, but I think it was the result of naivety. And one consequence of that horrible experience was that The Guardian ever since has been absolutely passionate about protecting whistleblowers. I think it's an experience which was educational for us. In my own journalistic activities, I depend pretty continuously on whistleblowers. I mean, I can remember way back again in the 1980s, after the Falklands War, another civil servant, Clive Ponting, who was arrested under the Official Secrets Act for leaking documents to an MP, to Tam DL. Yeah, I'm sure you do. And he wasn't a secret whistleblower in that sense, but we were able to help him and work with him. And in fact, I remember helping get him a lawyer, and we worked with him in some of the documents and some of the material that he had in his possession, and it generated a lot of quite important stories. And in the end, Clive got acquitted, which was pretty good. And in more recent years, we did long investigations into bribery and corruption at BAE, and we depended very much on whistleblowers. And there were people who came to us then with evidence of corrupt payments that you don't know who they are, and that's because we succeeded, I guess, in protecting them. And I would like to think that we will go to the nth degree to protect people like that, because without them, journalists are nothing. Journalists cannot tell people in a democracy what's going on unless people tell the journalists. Me, I'm a journalist, I know nothing. I only know what I'm told, really, what people are prepared to pass on to me. So whistleblowers are the lifeblood of democracy in that sense, even though they sometimes have to pay the price for what they do. So, because of that history, the extraordinary situation with Bradley Manning is something that's very close to our hearts. Everybody says it's really difficult. You can't say Bradley Manning was the source of all the WikiLeaks material because that assumes his guilt. I think between these four walls we can speak more freely, because I don't think anything that's said here is likely to worsen Bradley Manning's prospects, and nothing I say counts as evidence. And I have no personal knowledge of Bradley Manning leaking or not. That all said, it appears from the things which have been published from his own chat logs, the conversations he had with a fellow hacker, Adrian Lamo, that Bradley Manning was the source of every single one of the extraordinary mountain of documents which have been leaked to WikiLeaks in the last year and subsequently published in The Guardian and elsewhere. So this diminutive soldier, he's only 5'2", appears to have been responsible for putting literally hundreds of thousands, 750,000 files from the US military into the public domain. And many of those have been really, really important. They painted a picture, an unsanitized, unvarnished picture of the American war in Afghanistan, and indeed the British war as well. It shines a sidelong light on that, and the war in Iraq, and the American detention camp at Guantanamo, and the conduct of American diplomacy all across the world in recent years. It's impossible to overstate the importance of that. We have seen an authentic picture of the conduct of the world's sole superpower and self-styled global policeman. And I think it's been immensely educational. Even if we don't point to individual scandals, which you can do, we can say the whole process has been beneficial to humanity at large. And we're still seeing, because Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are still churning out these cables to different countries, sort of more obscure countries like Jamaica, for example, or Indonesia. So actually every week the stock of knowledge is being increased. And the result of this for Bradley Manning has been awful. He has been now for a year in military custody in the harshest conditions. It's very much thanks to the campaigning of Anne, among others, that an international spotlight has been shone on what's been going on, and that he has been moved from a brutal confinement at Quantico, where he was shaken awake every 5 minutes, basically, in order to ensure that he was all right and not committing suicide. So you see cruelty being disguised as concern in a sort of Kafkaesque manner, which is characteristic of the American legal system, I think. So he's been suffering horribly. He's been in military jails for a year now. So far, he has not been tried. He has been pressurized and persecuted, I think, in the hope that he will implicate others, such as Julian Assange and other people connected to WikiLeaks in the United States. And I think the more attention that's paid to his plight, the better. I don't say that he does not deserve to be punished in some way. I don't say that he should be freed and given a medal. I think his position is analogous to conscientious objectors in wars, that if you object in that way, you must expect to be punished by the military sometimes. And some of the material that he's leaked, I think you have to concede, should not have been leaked. From my point of view, so much of the material that's been leaked was so important that the good outweighs the bad. But I wouldn't expect the military authorities to take that point of view. There are two major films coming out about Bradley Manning. PBS Frontline in the United States are putting out a 1-hour documentary tonight, their time, 9 p.m. US time, which I think you can see online. They have done a lot of work in putting together a picture of Bradley Manning's story, and I would recommend you to watch it. And similarly, The Guardian, my own paper, we have put together a 20-minute film which we're going to premiere on Thursday. And we've also talked to Bradley Manning's friends. And most interestingly, we've talked to the people in the remote military base out in the Iraqi desert, Camp Hammer, where he was stuck and where he saw things and was in an environment that I think profoundly affected him and profoundly affected his feeling that what was happening was wrong. And I think when you see the film, you will see there's an atmosphere of tedium, of brutality, of sadism, of cynicism, of the fag end of a war, which is quite connected with the way Bradley Manning behaved. So I would recommend those, and I would recommend you to do what you can to ameliorate Bradley Manning's conditions, because the vengeful US military is not a pretty sight.
I think WikiLeaks has been a difficult one for us to play. As David has found, we've had similar issues where we've considered that we've been very supportive of WikiLeaks as an organisation. We gave them an award in 2008, long before we get to this particular case. We've had some difficulties in the spotlight we've thrown on the organisation. Certainly we've had some difficulties I think we've had some issues with the way some of the cables were dealt with, because we deal with it from the other end, and I think there are human rights campaigners that we were very worried about. But obviously that agenda has completely changed with the Arab Spring, because a number of our concerns were based in Tunisia, which is a country in which we've been working a great deal. And I think on a sort of more general rule, I mean, I'd agree with David in that the US treatment of Bradley Manning has been completely disproportionate. The way leakers like Bradley, or alleged leakers, are treated is completely different to the way the press, the government react when top officials go to the New York Times and plant a story. I mean, we're looking at both ends of the same spectrum. If you're exposing waste or illegality, why is it different for an official to expose that to a member of Congress? And I think there are some real difficulties about the way Bradley is being treated. I mean, Obama made a number of promises in the election period about open government, freedom of information and transparency. And yet we have an administration which has prosecuted 5 people. And previous administrations have only prosecuted 3 of these cases in the last 40 years. It's an astonishing change. It's not just Bradley Manning. There are a number of cases that raise serious concerns about the way the US government is taking people who expose things. There can be no doubt that many of these cases, these were things that needed to be in the public domain. People must, if they have serious concerns and take them to their supervisors, be able to expose these kind of issues. There must be an outlet. Otherwise, how can the public hold their government to account? And the answer is, if everything is secret, and there's been a huge issue in the US about overclassification over the last 10 years from the war on terror, secrecy is really problematic. It allows officials to depart from legal norms. If you can't expose that, how do you hold your government to account?
I first raised the case of Bradley Manning with William Hague in beginning of March, and in a select committee which was broadcast. And I told him beforehand that I was going to raise it, and he then responded before the select committee by saying he's an American, nothing to do with us, basically. So I said once again, his mother actually is Welsh, and anybody who's born, whose one parent is British, can also be considered to be British, even if they don't have a British passport. Now, eventually they agreed to that, and I had an adjournment debate on the floor of the House of Commons, and the Minister, Foreign Office Minister, who then replied, agreed, yes, he could be considered to be British also. And that I was calling for any consular assistance that the family might need, any consular assistance that Bradley himself might need. And I've had varying responses from various ministers in the Foreign Office. And it sort of culminated the week before last, when yet another minister said, he's not British, he's American. I made a big fuss. I started shouting at him in the chamber, and then he was called back on a point of order, and he had to say that I was right. And then he asked to speak to me outside and said, well, if Bradley asks for help through his solicitor, then he can have help. So I said, but his mother is asking on his behalf for help. So why is his lawyer's view more important than his mother's view? So I've also spoken to the lawyer who actually thanked us for all the international pressure we've put on, and he said, carry on doing it. And I've also spoken to a congressman. We're now in touch because he's been raising Bradley's case in the US Congress, and he's very extremely concerned. He told me, actually, the last conversation I had with him, which was a week before last, he said the way things are now in the United States, they could very well call for the death penalty. Now, we have heard that, you know, that the family has heard that they won't be calling for the death penalty, but for the congressman to say that, I think, is of considerable concern. I know that the British Embassy in Washington have on 2 occasions been actually into the State Department to tell them about the strength of feeling in this country about the way Bradley Manning was being treated. So they may not want to admit it, but they have already got involved. I also raised it when I was with the Foreign Affairs Select Committee at the beginning of March in Washington and New York, and I did it as a sort of teasing thing, really, asking them what effect WikiLeaks had on anybody. And in the Department of Defense, they sort of immediately kind of bristled. And they were clearly pretty annoyed that I'd even asked the question. But other people were more sort of laid back, you know, and weren't as defensive as the D&D. So, I mean, I think it's a very stupid position, because position, as the last British minister told me, was if Bradley asks, but he must ask through his solicitor for, you know, British involvement. Well, I think it is important to have British involvement. I think Bradley needs every bit of help he can get. And his relatives in this country, his closest relatives, they're both unwell. And, you know, it's very difficult. A lot of people want to interview them, but they are actually not ready to be interviewed at the moment. If they heard from Bradley, I think they, you know, might change their minds. But they really are waiting to hear from Bradley. I've written to him directly myself this week. I've sent a letter to Bradley. But it's a letter that had already been sent to the family, and they were going to hand it over to his father and ask his father to take it in to him when he next visited him in the new prison he's in. Where apparently he's got better conditions. But, you know, we just told that because they took a number of the press around, as you know, and said, look at this lovely place, you know, great place, much better than the place he was at before. He can mix with other prisoners, he can watch television, he can receive letters. Well, we'll see whether he can receive letters or not, because I haven't heard from anybody who's had a reply from Bradley. So, you know, there's got to be a question mark over all of that. And, you know, if he is to serve a prison sentence, I know his relatives in this country would prefer him to be serving it here than in the United States. Now, with Obama, of course, Obama's been asked a couple of times in press conferences. First of all, when Bradley was being held in Quantico, and he said that he checked with the Pentagon and that he was he's been treated appropriately. And then went on to talk about, you know, appropriate for somebody who's broken the law. But, you know, Bradley hasn't been tried.
Quite.
So, you know, was it appropriate for the President of the United States to make a comment of that kind? Can Bradley receive a fair trial? Should it be before in an open court rather than a military court? I think there are lots of questions that we need to keep asking, because I think it's very important to have observers at the trial. If there are 32 charges against him, which I understand is the case. Now, I've got a particular sympathy for Bradley because for 7 years I was the Special Envoy for 2 Prime Ministers on human rights in Iraq because of my long involvement with Iraq. I went to Iraq 26 times. I used to write a report after every visit, and they went to the Prime Ministers. I gave that evidence to the Chilcot inquiry because I raised a lot of concerns which are now, in the light of the 3 Amnesty recent reports, underlying concerns that I expressed at the time. For instance, handing over people in American detention to the Iraqis when the Iraqis didn't have the capacity to deal with them. And I made that point many times before the Americans handed them over. And now, we said at the weekend we're pulling out, all the troops are coming out of Iraq, hooray. But, what are the things that we ought to be doing in Iraq? What sort of pressures should we be putting on the Iraqi government in the light of Amnesty's reports? The present ambassador in Iraq, British ambassador, has now gone to, where's he gone? To Libya. And I don't know yet who's replacing him. But there are certain things that should be said to the government of Iraq. But because Bradley Manning was one of the first things, according to David's book, was that Bradley was, looking at his screen one day and he was asked to go off and interview some Iraqi detainees in an Iraqi police station. And he went to interview them. The allegation was they were distributing subversive literature. Bradley looked at it, had it translated, and found that what it was actually a very good critique of corruption in Prime Minister Maliki's government. So he goes off to his bosses with this information and is told to sort of, run off, go and find some more detainees. And then, of course, the other one is the shooting from an American helicopter of unarmed civilians and subsequent deaths. So, I do have a lot of sympathy with him if he looked at these things and thought, well, if nobody's taking any notice, what are we here for? His mother asked me the other day, what about the people who shot from the helicopter? What's happened to them? Well, I don't know that answer.
Decision I'd like to have investigated, it will be done one day, is the extraordinary decision that we took to go into Helmand in 2006. There was a debate here, but there wasn't a vote. And at that time, we lost 2 soldiers in combat, 5 in other accidents and other incidents. But just 2 lost and been there 5 years. And since then, we've lost tonight 366. Most of them because we went into Helmand. And the reasons we went into Helmand, and there's evidence that we gave in the last 6 months, people, Public Administration Committee, the Defence Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, are the most trivial reasons. I mean, it's hard to believe we went in there for hubris in order to make sure the soldiers were actually engaged, because the fear was you use them or you'd lose them. And it was it was a job creation program for the army to justify the existence. And this is, it's there on the record of the committees. I mean, it has to come out one day. And this awful decision that we took, unless we get, and there's so much that's come out from WikiLeaks that's informed us of what's going on, but we're fighting these battles ostensibly for certain reasons. We don't hear, the truth coming out. And there's the statement by Siegfried Sassoon about this war he made in 1917, saying this war is being prolonged by those that have the power to stop it, and it's absolutely true of what's been happening in Afghanistan, and particularly Helmand. And unless we can get some transparency, unless we can get the truth, we're likely to blunder into further mistakes in the future. So, I mean, he'd be seen as a hero, I'm sure, one day, and the WikiLeaks contribution to our knowledge will be applauded in the way that it should be.
The lawyer is also a retired lieutenant colonel, I think, who served in Iraq. So I find that all very strange, because conversations with him, he told me all he deals with are military cases. And he did say that of all the military cases he's dealt with, this is the chap who's been the worst treated. So, that's quite a big saying from a chap who presumably will hope to get, other cases referred to from the military in the future. So I don't quite know how he was chosen, David.
Well, I don't know, but I
No.
think if the family were involved. I think it certainly wasn't allotted to him. He did have some choice about it.
Some choice, yes.
Some choice, yes. I mean, whether the legal strategy has been a good one, I don't know, because originally I think Coombs was quite interested in the idea of portraying his client as insane. And I think there was a revolt from the family about that one, and I think it's been dropped. And he's now been found not to be insane. So.
That's good. That was wasn't that one of the reasons why they had to ascertain whether he was alive and not going to commit suicide every 5 minutes?
Yes, I mean that there was concern about his mental state. This was the
whether or not his mental state would have been aided by the regime to ensure his mental state is another matter.
A friend of his named David House, who is a computer scientist from Boston, and David played an enormous role in actually getting news of how Bradley was being treated out into the world. Because it's kind of incredible to think. We're now at the first year anniversary of Bradley's arrest. It wasn't until December when Glenn Greenwald's article for Salon.com came out, and that was the first news anybody had about how Bradley was being treated. People knew that he'd been arrested and was being held, but nothing was known about the conditions at all. Nothing was known about the fact that not only was Bradley in maximum security, which is the highest, the most severe type of detention there is in the US penal arsenal, he was also being held under an ostensibly medical order called a prevention of injury order, which meant that, for instance, he would have, as David has said, he would have guards check on him every 5 minutes, and Bradley would, and he would be asked, "Bradley, are you okay?" And Bradley would have to answer those people, "Yes, I am okay." You couldn't just nod or look people in the eye and it would be understood. He had to say, "Yes, I am okay," every 5 minutes. And to actually think about that and what that's going to do to a person, I don't, and then to have that framed as something which is for their benefit or looking after them, is horrifying. And it was really reading those details and, and thinking about what that would, actually meant that made me want to start up the UK Friends of Bradley Manning campaign, essentially. And it's, very much thanks to Anne and thanks to The Guardian as well that we've had the sort of astonishing success we have. Because I think it's when you're looking at what's happening to Bradley and you're sort of almost like facing up to the might of the Pentagon, and it seems like an enormous challenge, an insurmountable challenge, but actually to prove that by talking about what's going on and letting other people know and making your voice heard, you can really change things, I think is very important. And whatever we think about what Bradley is alleged to have done in bringing the misdeeds of government to light, just the way he has been detained and the way we have changed that, and it is due to the campaign that we have changed that in itself, in that Bradley has really shone a light, in what governments do and how they try to keep their misdeeds away from the public eye, and how actually once people have information, we have an astonishing power to change things.
And one particular angle that is not often explored and quoted is that Bradley Manning is a gay man. And I have here a letter which we are issuing today, started circulating, addressing the fact that lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and queer organizations and individuals have not been particularly vocal about this case. Many of them, especially in the States, prefer to campaign for an equal right to kill, for gay people and lesbian women to be admitted on an equal base to the army, rather than fight against wars and the ability to kill other people. Many of them are gay and lesbians. His case shed some light also on the contribution the gay men in particular have given to the Refusnik movement internationally. In fact, the first US soldier who publicly refused to fight in Iraq is a man of color, Stephen Funk, which we supported and spent 5 months in jail. Another big case was the case of Mehmet Tarhan in Turkey. He's a Kurdish conscientious objector who was in prison for 11 months and tortured. And then with the intervention also of the European Parliament, we had 20 MPs signing an open letter to the Turkish government. He was eventually released. And the other aspect of it, and I'm sorry, I may be a bit long, but I think some stuff needs said. The other aspect of it is that the kind of solitary confinement and torture prisons, torture conditions of in which Bradley Manning found himself, in fact, as a precedent in the amount of tens of thousands of prisoners, most of them people of color, are in fact in solitary isolation in US prisons for decades. People who were in the Black Panther Party have been in solitary confinement for 20, 30 years. The fact that already one of his lawyers, civilian lawyers, a man called Kevin Zeese, said that what Obama said amounts to unlawful command influence. So there's a kind of, I think there's a kind of focus. And I really thank, publicly, I think I had to, what Naomi, Colvin and UK friends of Bradley Manning did so far. No, because we, in spite of our tradition as payday of supporting conscientious objectors and refusniks, we've been slow on this. And we now getting into here, and I think that this angle of Bradley Manning being gay is something that we really should publicize and fight for.
I mean, it seemed to me, with these complexities and paradoxes, the only thing we could all agree on was Bradley must have a fair trial. That was the thing we could all campaign on, and that everybody in Britain would be sympathetic to.
And the advice coming out of the US has been, I mean, I'm sure you've spoken to it, I mean, you've both, it's been quite contradictory by people saying, I don't understand why they're not aiming towards this sort of offence, and people saying, well, that would be suicide. I mean, legal advice is, it's a piece of string, and
I have Stuart.
Sorry, I also work for the Parliamentary Human Rights Group specifically. My question is, we've talked a little bit about the attitude to Bradley Manning in the United States. How is the New York Times, which was the kind of sister paper in releasing these leaks, how are they treating the case of Bradley Manning? And I guess the second question I might have is, I know WikiLeaks has done work prior to the Bradley, if we call them the Bradley Manning leaks. That was kind of the making of WikiLeaks in the public sphere. What do you think the future is for WikiLeaks once they have played out what they got potentially from Bradley Manning?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you that. I think that was a great big one-off for WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks was a niche player before and may revert to being a niche player afterwards. But I've tried to separate, I mean, The Guardian is now trying to separate what is being said and what's being done about Bradley Manning's condition from the WikiLeaks issue, not least because we in The Guardian have rather fallen out with WikiLeaks. In fact, we have very much fallen out with WikiLeaks. And, we've concluded that Julian Assange is impossible to work with, and in some ways is an unsuitable person for us to work with. But our attitude about Bradley Manning is a straightforward human rights issue, that he's being mistreated, and also we recognise that what he has done has resulted in things that we have written about at enormous length in The Guardian and said are important. So, we owe him some concern for that.
And the New York Times, I mean, what do you think?
Well, it was one of the reasons why Julian Assange fell out with the New York Times at an early stage, was he took objection to the way they were writing about Bradley Manning, and he said that they were psychologizing him and depicting him as a tormented gay with a troubled childhood, whereas they should have been addressing more the question of his political awakening. I mean, I think that was a vain hope, frankly, from the New York Times.
I thought there were some really interesting articles done by Rolling Stone around, rogue soldiers in Afghanistan and showing the effects of, the effects of war on soldiers. And you've spoken about Iraq and the conditions there and the tedium, and another gentleman said, well, we went into Helmand just to keep them busy and feeling engaged. And I've thought that those kind of issues and publicity around those kind of issues can have an impact on perception about Bradley Manning's trial as well.
One of the things that my colleague Maggie O'Kane's film about Bradley, which is coming out in a couple of days, has picked up. She said they talked to people who were on the base with him, and they said extraordinary picture emerges of the atmosphere of aimlessness, of tedium, of suicides on that base and others, and there's an enormous number of suicides are happening among US soldiers in Iraq, and something about the sort of dysfunctional atmosphere of that base is, I hope, going to come out, that was the world that Bradley was stuck in which bad things were happening to depressed and angry people.